Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this Dynamics 365 and Power Platform special interest group. Delighted to have you along with us on this Friday afternoon. The session today will be presented by myself, Chris Parks, and also with help from our CTO, Michelle van den Brink. The agenda that we have for you today, we were trying to keep this standard, obviously. First off, we're going to talk about the new commerce experience. I was in two minds whether or not to put this in and put this on the agenda. It has been covered elsewhere, but it's a really significant change from Microsoft that's been announced to CSP licensing, and there is impact on your customers. So we thought it best to deliver a brief overview for you here. We've got details of a new podcast series and something specific from Microsoft around developing against the Dataverse, which we'll cover, and then we'll do a little bit more detail on the Canvas App Designer for model-driven apps, which we ran out of time for last month. And then towards the end, something from Michelle. It's been coming more and more to the fore recently. We've been receiving questions about when is it right to use Azure Logic Apps? When is it right to use Power Automate and vice versa? So we'll cover some of that off as the session goes on today. As usual, we've got a mixed audience today. So not just sales, marketing, also consulting services, technical services, and some from more of a developer slant. So as the session goes on, it will get more and more technical. We'll start off with the business updates. The intention was always to kind of run it that way. As always, the session's nothing if it's not valuable to you. So I would urge you, please feedback. The survey link is at the bottom there. We need to know what's valuable, what's not. Specify in there what it is that you would like us to deliver. It will take you less than 60 seconds to tick the smiley faces, yes, no, and I do read every comment that you put in there verbatim as well, I promise, even the ones which are left anonymously. It's perfectly acceptable to do that as well. I'm very happy to hear the positives and the constructive criticism as to how we can make this better for you. So to begin with, on the Microsoft update, I talked about this Microsoft new commerce experience for cloud solution providers, and it is licensing before you go to sleep and turn off. I think the headline is that there's a 20% price premium coming on monthly billing through new commerce experience, so that should probably get your attention before you all switch off if you didn't know about this already. There will be action you need to take before March 2022. Which is when this starts to come to fruition. You can start this through October. So a few details. The new commerce experience originally started with Microsoft Azure. It was in place from January 2021. They announced December 2019 or January, and it started in July. So they gave people 6 months notice that all new Azure CSP business would have to be on an Azure plan offer. It talked about having greater flexibility for customers, the ability to put everything under one roof, as it were, and that you couldn't transact on the previous Azure offer. You would have to use the Azure plan. Kind of leveled the playing field a little bit for Azure agreements, which was all a positive. And the other thing that is worth noting is that the CSP was always slated to supersede the perpetual licensing via open or even open value subscription for non-perpetual licensing as well. That's been in place for over 20 years from Microsoft. Anybody who knows the history, that's been the kind of the key way to get out to the small and mid-market through traditional distribution, and that had kind of 3-year subscriptions with software assurance included, or you could buy without and add that at the end of the term, and so on and so forth. What's interesting there is that it was only in June when Microsoft talked about a return period for software subscriptions on CSP and other means there. You would receive prorated credit. They reduced the date from 60 to 30 days to get that. What happened in August, it was August the 19th when they kind of put this announcement out. From October 2021, Microsoft said they would bring seat-based cloud offers to the new commerce experience, and it was across a breadth of products. It was Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, Power Platform, as well as Windows 365. The two things here and why we thought we needed to cover this today, Dynamics 365 and Power Platform in particular. And it was really a 6-week lead time because, you know, August the 19th to October 2021, it gives you 6 weeks to think about what's going to be relevant and what's going to be listed. There are a few specifics on this new commerce experience announcement. I've dropped the link in there if you want to head on over and read this yourself. They talked about exclusive new offers. By exclusive, I think they meant the inclusion of benefits. It was sketchy on detail. There was some in there. They talked about hybrid use benefits, which I assume means on premises rights, but it wasn't explicitly documented. It talked about home use programs, could be very valuable for things like Microsoft 365. It talked about multi-geo add-ons, which suggests the ability to sell outside of existing territories, again, all to be confirmed. They also talked about the ability to be able to provide stable pricing for long-term customers with predictable needs. And they were enabling that with the creation of 1-year terms and 3-year terms. So that does, of course, mirror open value subscription, open license, kind of through the old model. The key is that you know, you can sell upfront and you can pay monthly as a partner. So you could sell 12 months upfront, or you could sell 3 years upfront, collect the cash from your customer, and then continue to pay QBS monthly. The difference on those agreements is that you would never expect the customer to continue to pay monthly, because you as partners are on the hook for the entire bill, because they changed the cancellation terms or the cancellation policies as well. Did Microsoft as part of this. So they were making them consistent, and they're going to be consistent with themselves. If you cancel after the first 72 hours of the term, you are liable for the entire amount of the order for the entire term. So the term can be 1 month, 1 year, or 3 years. So important that if you do sell on a kind of an annual or a 3-year basis, that you collect the cash up front from your customers, because you're the party that's liable. They also talked about the subscription ownership enforcement was how they put it across, to prevent multiple trials within a customer. And by that, they've said that free trials will auto convert to paid subscriptions. So if you currently, if you're offering trials to customers, they free trials as part of the CSP process, be aware that they will auto convert to paid subscriptions. So you're going to need to monitor and manage those trials and the end dates of those trials much more carefully. If you don't already, if you just let those lapse, they will convert to paid subscriptions. It didn't say which term they were going to convert to paid subscriptions on. One would assume monthly, but still all to be confirmed. I think the key to it is that in these terms now, you are unable to go down at any point in the term, so it's fixed. So after 72 hours, you are liable for that seat count for the term. You can't say drop from 100 seats to 50 seats or 20 to 10 at any point during the term. You can do at the end of the term, which means that the most flexible offer is the monthly term, and that's where they said there'd be a price premium, which we understand to be 20%, going to be delivered on top of the current kind of CSP as all the business moves to new commerce experience. So the other thing, probably one thing there worth mentioning, there is an ability to blend these terms and these deals, so you can actually mix and match the monthly, the annual, and the 3-year. So you could have the bulk of the customer on the annual subscription. You could have then seasonal workers or similar just signing up on a monthly basis. So that was the gist of it. And that was kind of the basically the headline agreements. It stemmed lots of questions. We don't have all of the answers, and I don't actually think Microsoft have all of the answers right now. Just to give you a timeline on customer transitions to new commerce experience, it will be available from October. They said the 1st, the date looks like it's changed to the 14th. If a customer wanted to procure annually from October 2021, they can do. All new customer subscriptions, so you're only going to be able to do new orders and renewals from March next year, so March 2022. Again, it's a 6-month window for that kind of basically for you to transition your operational systems if you are used to billing flexibly CSP monthly, and to get your house in order to cater for this. I'm going to skip over the incentives right now because, again, details are sketchy, let alone how they are actually going to manage and monitor this for Dynamics. The Azure one requires delegated admin as the key. So there's going to have to be something different in place from a Dynamics perspective for that to be possible. And again, awaiting confirmation. But the key post anniversary dates post February 2022, from 2023. February, every customer right now, existing, new subscriptions are all going to be on the new commerce experience. They won't be renewable on CSP. So it kind of does feel a little bit like the end of CSP as well. And NCE is probably the jargon, the acronym. It'll become part of the Microsoft lexicon, and that's where we'll be moving forwards. We do believe there's going to be promotions in place. And I think as partners, you've got to think about how you position these 3-year SKUs, price protection, kind of for customers who really want that long-term stuff. The 1-year SKU, great if you want to get the discount. Microsoft, the two statements that I've kind of seen, one likens this to the advanced flight booking system, where when you book a train ticket in advance, you get a better deal than if you want a flexible fare. So you're going to get that benefit on the annual. And the second is around that CSP, the terms are always annual. They've just never enforced the cancellation policy, and they've allowed people to flex up and down. So think about your existing customers, think about your prospects in the pipeline, what this means to them, and new customers, and just think about how you can have this conversation. And so you've got 6 months at least until the kind of anniversary dates where the renewals must happen on NCE. So hopefully it's enough time to have conversations. As we get more of the details moving forward, then we will absolutely share them with you over time. So that's the kind of headline new commerce experience. As I said, I was in two minds whether to share it because it's very generic Microsoft, but the impact is broad. I'm pretty sure that everybody on this call will transact CSP. So that was what we thought you would need to know. Second up today, I'd like to introduce you to this Power Platform podcast that we've created. We kind of realized that not everyone has time to read up on all of the Microsoft documentation. There's a lot of it out there, and there's only so much we can get across as part of these sessions from the level of introduction, because as I said, we've got a mixed audience. So we have a lot of people who've been involved in Power Platform and Dynamics 365 for a long time. So what we thought we would do is basically create a simple to understand overview without any jargon, and try and deliver that in a conversational format in under 10 minutes, or put a limit on kind of 10 minutes to explain each of the topics in turn. Now, don't listen to these if you want a deep dive technical overview, is what's available. They've been created as part of it's what I term the CSO role that partners have been asking for, and that's Chief Simplification Officer. It's about taking the concept, taking the technology, and just helping you understand what it means in real simple terms and breaking it down. And hopefully, if this is your kind of introductory journey, or you want to know a little bit more about the history of the Dataverse and where Project Green came from the Navision Xapta acquisitions and how it's all come into place, that's the type of content that we've put on these podcasts. To date, we've done 2 of them, what's Power Platform and what the Microsoft Dataverse is. It's purely for Microsoft partners. It's not targeted at customers, so it's not something really you should share, because we try and answer 3 questions in each episode. What is it? Why is it relevant to me? And also, how can I make money from this as a partner? Where's the commercial opportunity? So there are more episodes planned. We're going to talk about Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI. We've thought about other things that we could possibly cover. Again, I'd love feedback on this, so please do feel free to get in touch directly, or through the form survey at the end of this, and let me know what you would like to be covered, and also any feedback on the content that's being provided there. So, other thing, found this month. I've popped it into the QBS newsletter as well. Anybody who knows kind of Postman, it's a tool that's used by developers. It's very popular to connect to web APIs. If you come from the Business Central side of the fence, you're probably very familiar with Postman from a historical perspective. You can now easily connect this to Microsoft Dataverse. Microsoft have provided a pre-approved Azure Active Directory application. It's configured to support OAuth explicit grant flow, which is kind of the authentication mechanism. And so if you really want to set up an environment to test out connectivity to the Microsoft Dataverse web APIs, you can do that now. You can start exploring the APIs there through the OData v4 web service using Postman. And you can do that using an application client ID provided by Microsoft. I'm kind of semi-technical is what I would say. I used to have a strong technical background, but obviously I've been in the commercial environment for quite some time. So I thought the only way that I could see if this was viable and as easy as they made it sound, I looked at the full documentation, thought, oh, that seems quite complex. But I found also the how-to config video, which is 10 minutes. I managed to get this working successfully with the Power Apps developer plan. So the Power Apps developer plan is available for free from Microsoft. You can sign up for that as an individual. So I've successfully tested it. I've successfully got it working. I've successfully retrieved data from Dynamics 365 and kind of Dataverse core entities using this utility. It took very little effort. It was a case of sign up for the developer plan, install Postman, which is free, and then just follow through the how-to config video, replacing the URLs with the ones that I had in my environment. So all the documentation is there for you. You'll need the Dataverse environment, obviously, but if you are thinking more and more about how you can get started with Dataverse and how you can program against it, access the APIs, that's a fantastic tool and a fantastic kind of how-to video that I came across this month. So it's the end of the Microsoft update. I'm conscious there might be questions right now. We're on a slight delay from the live meeting. I don't see any particularly that popping up. I'm hoping Ruben, who's on the call with me, will give me a nudge if there are any of those. Otherwise, I'm going to hand you over to Michelle van den Brink, who's going to start with the conceptual overview. And it's the Canvas apps designer for model-driven apps. Michelle or Ruben? In which case it's Michelle.
Right. I think I saw two questions popping up. They're still in the queue on the Q&A tab.
Okay. What do we have in there, Michelle? Do you want to run them by me?
The first question is from Sam. He asks, is there any update on whether WebDirect is being updated for Dynamics 365 stroke Power Platform to mirror the NCE restrictions and costs?
There's a very simple and quick answer to that, and it's no. We have heard nothing about how they are going to update WebDirect to mirror this. We've asked the question. We're waiting a response. It's definitely a frequently asked question, and so hopefully, as soon as we know more, we will let people know.
Right. Then there's a second question that came in from Rachel, and she asks, are we still thinking that Dynamics 365 will be in the NCE and it's not just Microsoft 365?
Yeah, it was very clear on the announcement, very clearly labeled Microsoft Dynamics 365. There was a lot of pushback. So just from what we kind of know internally inside of Microsoft, and I talked there about how you measure delegated admin and how you measure the incentives. We know that Dynamics 365 as a product group weren't, all in on the new commerce experience, but the announcement was very, very clear, and it said that Dynamics 365 and Power Platform were part of it. The other things that I kind of start to think about around this are the consumption-driven SKUs, because they've announced that this is going to be there for seat-based offers, but they've said nothing about the monthly consumption when you need extra capacity for APIs, when you need extra capacity for other things that you might want to flex up and down on. So I think there's a lot of things that still remain to be made clear from Microsoft, and yeah, stay tuned. We'll keep people updated, I think. unsurprisingly, both questions on new commerce experience.
No, indeed. As always, it's they could devote an entire university course to Microsoft licensing. I feel it's always both a challenge and a mystery at the same time.
Yeah, like most university courses, by the time you'd finished it, it'd be all out of date. So.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Let's stick with the technology too, and Michelle.
That's all right. Thanks, Chris. Well, I'll take you through the relatively recent change. It's still in preview, so this is something that I would love to share with you, but it's still in preview. So please take everything I say with, put on your preview goggles, take everything with a grain of salt. But this is something that Microsoft is investing in, so it is good for us to take a look at it. In the Power Platform, we've had 3 types of apps in so far. At the very least, we have Canvas apps. Those are the apps that you can completely customize, look and feel, connect to any data source, and use however you like, both on web and on mobile. We've had the model-driven apps, which are very traditional apps coming from the Dynamics 365 portfolio, which work very well on a desktop, on a larger screen. A mobile equivalent also exists, which scales it down automatically, but in general is not as good looking as a Canvas app can be. And there's portal apps, of course, for that external access that we also have. And we can draw the line between those right here, where we have our internal apps, our Canvas apps and our model-driven apps for internal users. That's people like you and me, and that's everyone inside of our organizations, or from a customer perspective, of course, everyone inside their organization. And there's external apps where customers of our customers will access their data. Well, these internal apps, they've sort of been, there's always a choice. Do I go Canvas or do I go model-driven app? It is up to what is the purpose of your app. What do you need? Do you need specific connectors? Do you need very exotic connectors and dedicated connectors for external systems? Then you're likely ending up in Canvas apps very fast. Or do you need a consistent look and feel? Do you need that enterprise app that covers an entire business process? Then it's very likely that you'll need model-driven apps, especially when you're using the Dataverse for a lot of things. It's so easy to expose Dataverse tables and to interact with Dataverse tables and graphs and charts and all of your data through a model-driven app, given also that time benefit, because you don't need to design the app. Essentially, you just have a table and you turn it on in the model-driven app. You only have to create the table, or you only have to turn on the table. You don't have to design a whole app. So there's definitely a good choice and a bad choice for certain scenarios, but overall, you can be on the fence for sure on whether or not you should use one or the other. So that's why Microsoft is putting a lot of investment in combining these things, where we can now use the model-driven apps as sort of a framework, as a harness to create a larger apps. And these are the so-called converged apps or combined apps, where we can use the best of both worlds. Using the model-driven app as a framework to put all of this stuff in, we can now embed Canvas apps very easily inside of a model-driven app, either as a replacement for a section of a model-driven app, making the experience inside of your model-driven app a little bit richer, or replacing entire sections of the app completely in the shape of a so-called custom page. So these are the areas where you could do that. You could have a complete page that is essentially a Canvas app combined inside of your model-driven app, where you still have the traditional navigation on the left-hand side with your accounts, your contacts, your activities, and all of the other things that you need inside of your app. Plus, if you have some kind of custom process that you've already created in a Canvas app, or something where you need to pull information from an external data source and present it in a specific way that you couldn't otherwise do in a model-driven app, you can now create that combination where you have a page inside of the menu that just opens up a Canvas app, or rather, it looks like a Canvas app, it feels like a Canvas app, but actually it's a page. It's slightly different from a traditional Canvas app because it doesn't launch a whole new thing. It just loads right inside of your model-driven app. We can also create custom dialogues if you have one of those processes, for example, where you have to look up some information in a different system, that is a very common practice inside of a model-driven app, where you maybe also using an external system, you have all of your customers inside of the Dataverse, and the customers are also in a different system. They might be in an ERP system that runs outside of the Microsoft platform, or maybe it runs in SAP, or it runs in any other external application. You might want to pull in some information there or look up something quickly in an external system. That could be a custom pop-up that you've built, or that you built specifically for that purpose, where you can click on a button, search for some information, and then pull that information into your application, for example. In the past, there's been a lot of demand for integrations with official company registers, for example, the Chamber of Commerce registration, company house, or whichever one you have in your local region. That could be a great opportunity for that as well. They usually have an API that you can connect to, perhaps with a custom connector in the Power Platform. And that's something you can leverage inside of a Canvas app. So that's something now you can also leverage inside of a model-driven app, which traditionally doesn't really support custom connectors, but now it does, thanks to this layer of Canvas apps that we can sort of drape over it. Same goes for a side panel. The difference between a model dialog and a side dialog is, well, just look and feel, really. It's up to you to decide which one you want to use, and you can open them at any given moment, however you like, and put whatever you want in it. So it doesn't even have to be a Canvas app. It can be really anything you put in there, but the Canvas app experience is definitely the first party one that is the easiest to include. So a few examples of that would be, for example, this product configurator, where you're adding a product to a quote, and that comes with a bit of configuration. Well, rather than doing all of that through the model-driven app, which will likely be a lot of clicking, because you'd probably have to click open the product and select the properties that you want. That can be very complicated. Instead, we can use a custom page here, which is just a Canvas app, and pre-populated with all of the information that we've loaded in here in the model-driven app, and then load up the product configurator with all the various bits and bobs that this product comes with, and we can have people go through this experience in a much more streamlined fashion. We can replace things like subgrids, which traditionally look pretty boring, standards but boring. We can spruce those up by using a Canvas app there instead, to also show the images, for example, because inside of a model-driven app, traditionally images have been very much underlit. Sure, we do have this little circle up here usually where you can put a small picture, but for things like this example here, for property listings, for example, you might want to have a nice image where you can actually scroll through all of the listings and see all of them. And there's even a nice zoom in on the details page to the right-hand side here, where we can create this nice combination of having that large model-driven process here, the opportunity process, which is a very traditional model-driven process, but we can enrich it rather than us being left to buy or build something completely custom using the components framework, or there's some great add-ons from partners as well that create this type of experience. But now we have given, or Microsoft has given us this handy mechanism via Canvas apps, which we can all become familiar with because it's so very low code / almost no code to create these types of experiences that most Dynamics 365 consultants will be able to click and drag together a nice experience like this to make that Dynamics 365 experience that much nicer. Same goes for the contact lists over here. For example, we've included some profile pictures, which we can already store today in the Dataverse, but the Dataverse doesn't really do anything with that because that's just a boring subgrid over there. So here's an example of creating that nicer experience where you can have more immediate and direct access to that data, which would otherwise you'd have to click through to see some of this. And now it's surfaced immediately and visible immediately and actionable immediately, which saves everyone a whole bunch of time. Another example I have here is an invoicing system where to create an invoice, you may be using some external system rather than creating the Dynamics platform for that although it does contain invoicing capabilities, of course, and creation. You may be using a completely different system there, which already has a product configurator and all of that. You can service that functionality through a Canvas app, as long as that external system has an API, of course, and we could go through that. Last example I'll give you here is a bit of a dashboard functionality where you get more insights into someone's availability, for example, which can be visible inside of a model-driven app as well if you include some kind of a chart or if you were to track that in sub-records, but that would be much less attractive than what we have here, essentially creating a small Canvas app that pulls up a whole bunch of records that sit below the resource right here and presents it in a nice consumable fashion, which is something that we couldn't traditionally do inside of a Canvas or inside of a model-driven app, really. All thanks to these converged apps. So what does that look like? Well, if we create a new app, we can now choose an extra thing. So if we create a new app, a model-driven app, it will ask us now whether or not we want to use the classic designer or the new designer. Now, it does still have that little preview flag next to it, giving you that indication that this is something you don't necessarily want to use right away for production processes, but it is already a great way for you to experience things. So let's take a look at that new editor. We'll give this thing a name, so my new app. And everything looks a little bit different here, but essentially all the things that you're familiar with from model-driven apps are still here. We start essentially here by building out the navigation first, which is what we'll do in the classic application as well. So we can add a page, and then it will ask us what kind of page. This can be a table based on a view and a form, which is that very traditional model-driven app stuff, things like entity lists. So I'll add a few of those first. Let's say we want to add account. Of course, we want to add contact, and we want to add, let's say, the activity list and all the standard things that you add to an app. So we'll just add those. And now we already have our basic sitemap together. This group is still called group 1. We can, of course, change that as well. Go over to the navigation editor here, click on the group, and give this a nice group. So I'll just call this one customers. Something like that. Of course, activities is not really, it doesn't really belong in there. So maybe we should put an extra group in there. So I'll just create a new group in here. And traditionally that one is first, and we can just rename that one into my work, and then we can move the activities up in there. So we can move that up, and up again. Now it's in that group. All things that we could do before here to create a model-driven app, although this experience has been greatly simplified. The new thing we have now as well, of course, is that custom page. So this is a completely blank slate, or I should say a completely blank canvas, which allows us to embed any kind of Canvas app inside the experience, really. We can even pull from existing apps. If we've created one before, we can reuse that in multiple apps. So let's start by creating a new one. So let's call this my custom page. We'll wait for that to load. We'll be presented with essentially the Canvas app designer that you're probably already familiar with, but it's been stripped down a little bit because there's certain elements not in here. And we can see, for example, that the ribbon on top is severely stripped down. All of the markup elements are essentially pushed into the properties panel, so they're not up here, but we can still do all of the things over here. We can add a gallery, for example. So let's say we want to add a gallery, and we can still connect that to data. So let's say we want to connect it to our accounts. So it's going to wire that up automatically for us. Let's say we want that template to be a little bit bigger, so we can grab the gallery here. Well, let's say grab the subtitle. We can make most of that bigger, actually, because it's all quite small. So maybe, oops, just a template. It's a little bit difficult for me to do this when zoomed in so much, but get there. So let's make this a little bit bigger, and then we can make these things bigger. So let's say 20. but I don't want it to waste too much time designing an app that looks nice. We'll save it. So just give it a name. It already has a name, so you don't really have to specify anything interesting here. Go ahead and save it. Then it'll present us with a pop-up that it's done, and we could now go back to our model-driven app. It will be available in the model-driven app now already. What I'll do as well is I'll give this a quick publish just to make sure, because sometimes it doesn't work if you don't publish it, which can be a little bit weird that it doesn't tell you that you should publish this. But over here, it should become available now. That also doesn't work quite as smoothly as you might want it yet. So I'll just save this and publish this to save my progress, essentially, and then I can give it a refresh if this functionality still doesn't work. As you can see, it refreshes it on its own. So let's hope that that fixed it. And we could already preview this, because one of the nice benefits of this new editor, in contrast to the classic editor, is also that we can now go through it here. So we can see that that is actually working just fine. We can see everything in here. And this loads. It's all traditional app stuff, traditional model-driven app stuff. And now we also have our custom page in here. So there's a lot of design, of course, that comes with the custom page, which is completely up to you how to design it. But this, I hope that you can see that this opens up a lot of avenues to create the best of both worlds. I think back to you, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to me, Michelle. Sorry, I'm doing this Teams thing where my mouse cursor disappears, and I'm like, I can see the unmute button. I just couldn't quite get that through. Thanks. So I'm watching intently there as well. So just to clarify, the data source for the Canvas app that you just created within the model-driven app, what was the data source?
It was also the Dataverse, so it was the same Dataverse instance as the model-driven app runs on. But this can be anything. This can be any of those 340 plus connectors that we have available across the Power Platform. This is where those hybrid apps can really come into place, where you have your model-driven app, which pulls the information from the Dataverse, like always. But then maybe you also have some customer information stored in SAP, which you want to bring in, not necessarily through an integration, because integrations are hard to build and hard to maintain and always fickle. But a Canvas app can just pull that information live from SAP or from Business Central or from Salesforce, or you name it, wherever your customer data lives, you can pull it in and show it through the eyes or through the lens of this Canvas app.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Michelle. The reason why I wanted you to cover that today, we didn't have time for it last week, and I don't think we last month, and we didn't really get the concept across so well. And it is just that any data source, including the Dataverse, can be accessed from Canvas-driven apps. I know it's still in preview, but the ability there to create kind of much more visually appealing apps moving forward within kind of model-driven, it's going to be absolutely key. So if we just switch back to me, this is the part of the session where we normally do the partner showcase. I don't know if you can kind of see my screen right there. So last month, I asked if any of you would like to be considered for the partner showcase in the future. And if you've got a good story around Power Platform and any of the solutions, then I'd love to know more about it, so we can explore the value in presenting this back to the audience during these sessions. We have had, I guess I need to hit the share button as well. Probably why Ruben's telling me off. Here we go. We've had Gary Nixon on before now, and Sam from Strategy 365. They took us through their purchase order lifecycle management app, really valuable. We had Mark Christie on. He talked about demystifying Dynamics marketing, Mark from Proximo 3. And he actually showed us his own implementation, his own internal stuff that he got there inside of Dynamics marketing. Jason Bettridge from Circle was part of this. Showed off the Power BI dashboard and solutions that he uses to run his own professional services, the professional services part of his business. And then we had Jordan Brooks from Bespoke XYZ last month, talking about project management Power Apps, healthcare Power BI dashboards that they had created. And I've been asking every single month, if you want to be part of this, then I'd love to hear from you. The key to it is that no one volunteered this month, so it leaves us with a gaping hole in the agenda, where I just have to put out an appeal and say, if you've got anything that you've created on model-driven apps, on Canvas apps, if you've got something that's relevant through Power Automate, whether it's an integration scenario, whether it's a workflow scenario, please let me know about it. The feedback when it does come in on the forms, specifically has called out the partner showcase, saying how valuable it is to see this stuff really being used within businesses and within organizations, that it's really valuable. So don't be shy. Drop it in the Q&A window. If you need to leave it in the feedback form afterwards, send me an email, cparkes@qbsgroup.com. I'd love to include you in the October or November calls to showcase your awesomeness and your solutions. Otherwise, Michelle ends up talking over the entire session, and maybe that's what you were all after today, because we also talked about the fact that we were going to cover off Power Automate versus Logic Apps. This is a kind of a really important conversation, I think, that a lot of people are starting to have: where to use Power Automate, where to use Logic Apps, how the two fit together, what the differences are. And so after my appeal is over, for people to come and give me detail on Partner Showcase for the next 2 months, it's back to you, Michelle.
All right, thanks. Let's go back to my screen then, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between Power Automate and Logic Apps. So in essence, they are the same platform. Power Automate and Logic Apps are both using the same underlying platform, really. Flows, as they are defined, they're always defined in the same format, and that just so happens to be the format for Logic Apps. Essentially, Logic Apps was there first, and the use of it was not missed by the business apps team on the side of the Dynamics and Business Apps platform, and it was sort of folded into there as well. Underneath everything, it's the same platform, and essentially, if you run a flow inside of Power Automate, you're actually running it on the same architecture as Logic Apps uses. It's just with small differences, and those small differences is what we will be exploring today. So I'll compare them side by side for most of the slides, trying not to compare apples and oranges here, because there are a lot of small differences, and the difference doesn't really become an issue unless you make it an issue. It's all about purpose. What is the purpose of your process? How do you want to automate it, and why do you want to automate it? Those questions are the ones you want to ask to compare these things, really. So Power Automate is primarily targeted to end users and to makers, or so-called citizen developers, that are already using Microsoft 365 and Dynamics 365 to automate parts of their business process. So not necessarily targeted directly to Microsoft partners, but to people in the organization for sure. And of course, as Microsoft partners, we are supporting them. That brings us into the fold as well. But this is primarily focused on, you're already using Microsoft 365 or Dynamics 365 or something in the Biz Apps or in the Productivity Cloud. That is an area that could use some automation. That's where Power Automate really comes in. Then we have Logic Apps, which covers the same but also different. It's more targeted towards IT professionals and developers and administrators that might be using the Microsoft Cloud, or they might be more using things in the Azure area, where they're trying to automate not so much a business process, but an IT process. They also need to be automated, of course, and that's where Logic Apps comes in. where there is a considerable amount of overlap, because sometimes an IT process is actually a business process, or the other way around, you solve a business process by having an automated IT process. The decision is in the end really up to you which one to use, but these are the designed targets, the designed purposes of these two applications, and that's hopefully how you can also determine which one you should use over the other. All right, let's get into the concrete differences so you can hopefully make that decision even better. So the differences primarily are surrounding connector. That's one word. It's supposed to be two words. Connector availability, licensing options. The costs are very different as well. Performance is quite different. The authoring experience and also the operational experience, the DevOps experience, be it logging, maintenance, or the security aspects of the platform. So Power Automate has a lot of connectors, but they mostly focus on business processes. So these are all of the connectors surrounding Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, and the Power Platform. I'm not saying that there's no other connectors, but those are the primary connectors that the Power Automate team is focusing on to support and enable. Inside of Logic Apps, that's the other way around. They're not so much focusing on the business processes, but more on the IT processes. So Azure integration, Azure connectivity, and enterprise integrations, and things like custom code really get the priority on that side. Again, there's considerable overlap. There will be a lot of connectors that are available on both sides. But these are the focuses. There's two teams, essentially. One team focuses better on the business side. The other team is more focused on the IT side. There's a large list of connectors available. This is a quick highlight of the ones that are exclusive to either of these sides. So we see over on the Power Automate side, for example, we have the approvals, which is a very business and Office 365 driven process that's only available on Power Automate here. Same with desktop flows, which is native inside of Power Automate, really. Microsoft 365 compliance and Power Apps, buttons and notifications and all of that type of thing that connects very deeply into the Power Platform. That's all available exclusively on the side of Power Automate. The Dataverse is in this list as well, but that's the integrated Dataverse connector. There's actually two Dataverse connectors. You may have noticed that there's a green one and a gray one. The green one is the deeply integrated one, and that has more options. That's only available on Power Automate. And then there's the gray one, the less deeply connected. That's just the old Dataverse connector, shall we say. That's available in both. So that one, you can still use that in Logic Apps. Outside of the Logic Apps, on the side of Logic Apps here, you see some very enterprise-oriented connectors. Things like the BizTalk server and some IBM systems are in here, plus the ability to run custom code, for example. These are all much more IT-related, enterprise-related. This is not the complete list. There is a huge list of connectors out there, so we can have this entire list up in here, and I can place that in the chat as well, I think. Meanwhile, my Teams is trying to load here. Let's see if I place that here. I think that will work like that. So it's in the Q&A panel here now. We have all of these connectors available here. This list is being updated regularly, of course, and you can see there's an icon here, whether or not it's available for Logic Apps, and there's an icon available for Power Automate, for example. So if we were to go to approvals, which is, starts with the letter A, so that one should be reasonably high up here. So we can go over to approvals. And you can see here, for example, this one has the Power Automate icon next to it, but not the Logic Apps icon next to it. So there's quite a difference in the availability of certain connectors here. There's also a difference in grade. As you may know, there's connectors are divided into two groups. There's the standard connectors and the premium connectors. We have that little diamond icon for that. This one, for example, is a premium connector. If we zoom into it, we can actually see that it's only counted as a premium on Power Automate, on Logic Apps, is discounted as a standard. We'll get into that in a little while when we talk about pricing and connector pricing differences, but that will also vary whether or not something is considered a premium. In Power Automate, a lot of things are considered premium, but on Logic Apps, a lot of things are considered standard. So there's that difference. Things like approvals, as I mentioned before, is a great process for you to use inside of Power Automate. This is an action that you can place in the middle of your flow that will simply hold. It will pause the whole flow's run until a human makes a decision. It will reach out via an email to a human user, and that human user can then make the decision, approve or reject, or there's also options to add custom things. And then the flow will continue running only after that human has made a decision. There is a timeout mechanism. You can't take forever to make this decision. You have 30 days to make that decision, but that's a neat mechanism that we have inside of Power Automate only. Inside of both, there is also an alternative to the native approval process, and that's an Outlook connector. Inside of the Outlook connector, we have this option called send email or a send approval email, and that will effectively do the same, but that approval email is not nearly as attractive as this one. Essentially, that approval email is just a very standard email that you have to create. The only difference is that in the email, the approval buttons will be in there like an invitation. If you've ever received one of those Outlook invitations, you have those buttons, approve or deny, no, reject. One of those buttons in the Outlook toolbar, that essentially will mimic this. So this will work only very well if you send this to someone who's actually using Outlook, whereas these classic approvals inside of Power Automate will work if you send it to anyone. That doesn't matter what email client they are using. So it's good, but not as good. That's a trend that you'll see. There will be availability for some kind of connector in either, and one of them might be a little bit better than the other. There is up to you in the end to choose.
Michelle, we've got just before we go on to the custom code, there's a question from Sam around a scenario where a Logic app fires and they want to send a notification. Could that fire a Cloudflow? Basically, he's asking, can you call a Cloudflow? It's one of those days. Can you call a Cloudflow from a Logic app and vice versa?
Yes, you could. As part of a workaround, though, there's no native capability to do that, but you can use the HTTP connector to do that, or you can use the request connector to do that. You could essentially set up a flow inside of Power Automate that has the request trigger. So it has a URL that you can just call to trigger it, and you can then call that from Logic Apps and vice versa. These worlds, of course, work very similar, and that particular connector is available in both. So you can always use that request connector to trigger anything in either, really.
That's great stuff. Thanks.
Surely. The custom code connector is something that is only available inside of Logic Apps. This is a small code editor where you can run JavaScript, which will be interpreted by Node.js inside of the flow. You can manipulate any of the data that exists inside of your flow because it has access to all of the information from the trigger and all of the inputs and outputs from all of the actions. There's a whole host of syntax for us to go through there. I won't dive into that as deeply. But this is a great way for you to handle a little bit more complicated things. An example here is a regular expression that we will go through to see if an email address matches a certain expression, and we'll return that here as a Boolean, as a true or false. That's something that you cannot do in any other component. If you have a condition block, a traditional condition block, it would be extremely difficult to accomplish this the same result because a regular expression is so complicated and cannot currently be expressed in your standard Power Automate expressions or Logic App expressions for that matter, because they're the same language. So a custom code component is very valuable as an addition here, which is something that we cannot do inside of Power Automate today, unfortunately. There's an alternative, though. You can run custom code anywhere you want by attaching an Azure function, which is something that can just run any code that you'd like. And that's something that we've been using for a long time anyway, even before that custom code component existed, because that's a fairly recent addition, about a year and a half ago. Really, that was introduced for as a real thing. It's been in preview since forever. And an Azure function can always be called through an HTTP connector or through a custom connector, although that will always introduce additional costs, because of course that's just an additional thing that you've created somewhere else. It runs maybe in the same subscription, but it runs somewhere else. It has its own costs. Right. For the connections that we create, there's also quite a difference here, where running a flow in Power Automate, every time you add a connection, you have to add a user, or you have to use a user to create the connection. The action will also run on behalf of that user. So in any kind of logs or audit trails, you'll always have that licensed user that is performing that action, or that action is being performed on behalf of a user. That is also available in Logic Apps, but that's really where Logic Apps takes it even a step further. Managed identities from Azure Active Directory are also possible there, where you can have an identity, a principal identity, or a managed identity, depending on when you grew up. That terminology will be slightly different for you. But a managed identity right now in Azure Active Directory is just, let's say, an application user that can run things without being an actual user. So this requires no license. You can run these actions as this managed identity without a user identity provided. So this saves you a little bit of management. Should this particular user that is currently assigned to run these actions inside of Power Automate, should they be deactivated for whatever reason, because they leave the company or they're moving to a different business unit, it's very likely that that flow will start crashing, because now all of a sudden this user is disabled, or they don't have the appropriate license anymore, or they have reduced capacity due to a change in what license they have. That won't happen if you use managed identities inside of Azure AD, because that user, that managed identity user, that's not really a user, and that managed identity doesn't need a license. And sure, you can disable it, but you don't have to. It's not associated to any type of user. So whoever created this flow can do whatever they want. They can stay, they can leave, their user can be disabled, re-enabled. Nothing will happen to the Logic App flow. It will just keep running merrily all the time. Using managed identities is unfortunately not supported for every connector, but there's a lot of connectors but that's available, especially the ones that within the Microsoft platform. Those are generally supported. Outside of the Microsoft platform, there's definitely a lack of support for that. If you connect to an external system like SAP, you'll still have to connect as an SAP user, because SAP doesn't support the managed identity system from Azure AD. That is unfortunate, but that kind of makes sense as well. But for all of the Microsoft services, well, most of them, not all of them, there will be exceptions. This managed identity is very handy indeed. Another thing to consider is that running a flow will always require a license on the side of Power Automate. You always need a qualifying license. So be it a Dynamics 365 license that just happens to come with Power Automate, or a Power Apps or dedicated Power Automate license. The flow itself can also be licensed if you feel that licensing it through a user is not the option to go for. Of course, you can license it as a flow on its own. Not so much on the Logic App side. No license is required. You can just run it however you want and as whoever you want. No such licensing requirements here. So licensing, everyone's favorite topic, of course. Licensing is quite different. From Power Automate, licensing is purely done based on user licenses, or if the flow has a specific license on its own. Logic Apps is either licensed or priced based on costs of running it, or a fixed monthly cost. There is essentially a cost associated to running an action, which is a fraction of a cent every time you run it. Or if you want more predictable costs, you can also pay in advance for a fixed amount per month, and then you have more predictable costs. But essentially, you can run this only on consumption based, which can lead to a huge amount of saving in practice. Power Automate is, of course, included with Dynamics 365 and a lot of Power Apps licenses. There's an included allotment. Logic Apps is not included with anything, but because of its price difference, it is still a very attractive option. Those connector availability is, of course, the major difference. All of the connectors will be available across all of them. Of course, on the Power Automate side, we have that premium connector situation where some of the licenses will not qualify to use premium connectors, and you'll still have to buy an additional license to use those. That doesn't really happen on the Logic Apps side because there's only 4 premium connectors on the side of Logic Apps, and they're all IBM type systems, which are very infrequently used unless you are really that type of enterprise organization. So in general, you don't really have to worry about premium connections inside of Logic Apps. Almost everything is standard. And then there's license limits, which exist on the Power Automate side, but do not exist on the Logic Apps side. You can run as much as you want, as fast as you want it. Well, not as fast as you want it, but as much as you want it, without running into any kind of limits based on your license. And there will still be system limits, of course, because it's still a system and people will still need to run it and maintain it. So there will be limits there, but based on your license, there's no limits. So on Power Automate side, we have that license limit. Let's refresh ourselves what that means. We count those in Power Platform requests. Any type of action you perform on the Power Platform side inside of a Power Automate flow counts as a request. Any API call you make, any HTTP action you do, any execution you do, any action you call will consume some kind of action. Doesn't matter if your flow runs successfully or unsuccessfully, it will always count. Loops, a for or a while loop, that doesn't really matter, will of course exponentially increase those because now it will run several times and your actions will essentially exponentially grow as you have a loop that runs through 100 records, for example, and there's 5 actions inside of it. Okay, now all of a sudden that's 500 actions because it's those 5 actions times 100 records is 500. So that starts counting very fast. In addition to that, we also have to take into consideration that all of the other areas of the Power Platform are counted towards that same allotment. So it's not just your flows you need to worry about, it's everything else. If you're a user and you're using Power Apps, any type of request you make during a Power App, that will count as a request. Anything you run in Power Virtual Agents and anything you do with the Dataverse. Every time you read, write, or delete anything in the Dataverse, that will count as a request towards your allotments. Refreshing ourselves what those allotments are, we have them on screen here, but they're very well documented, and I don't think we need to go over them in great detail, but do keep those in the back of your head. These exist in terms of your licensing. If you go over them, you have to buy more expensive licensing. That doesn't happen in Logic Apps. If you go over this dramatically, nobody cares. The only thing that you notice is that your invoice will be marginally higher next month.
Okay, Michel, thanks for this. I know there's a whole lot more to cover here. Oh, yes. There's bits on performance, authoring, service limits, as the code editor. We're kind of out of time this month.
All right.
I'm going to ask those who are interested if they just want to come back direct, and we can always add some more on this to the agenda next month. Thank you very much for taking us through that. Really fantastic. I've learned a lot there in the space of kind of 15 minutes. So looking forward to hopefully picking this up again next month.
Of course.
Thanks. So final call to action for today, as we kind of hit the end of the week. Please do fill out the feedback survey. Please do come and volunteer for the Partner Showcase. We'd love to have your stories featured. If there's any questions, you want to quickly drop them into the window right now. Happy to kind of answer them or sort of do our best to provide more details. Otherwise, thank you very much all for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again next month.